On a night when snow fell like judgment over Widow's Hollow, Martha Holloway thought she'd face the storm alone. But in her sagging barn lay a bleeding man, a silent child, and a pup clinging to life. She only meant to offer food and a roof till daylight. Instead, she found herself opening a door she had kept shut since the day her husband died. What began as a night of survival would awaken a fight for trust, redemption, and the courage to stay. The wind had a way of howling through Widow's Hollow like it remembered every sorrow that had ever passed through. Martha Holloway had grown used to its voice, low, bitter, and uninvited. For the past 7 winters, she'd weathered the storms alone in her cabin at the edge of the pine brake, patching up the drafty corners with feed sacks and prayer. The hearth still burned, the chickens still clucked, and the gate still hung crooked from the hinge. James never got to fix. Life went on cold and bone-deep, but it went on. That night snow fell like judgment, thick, unrelenting. Martha sat in her rocking chair shawl tight, spooning out a stew made from whatever root cellar odds she could scrape together. The cabin was hushed, save for the rhythmic crackle of the fire and the occasional protest from aging floorboards. She wasn't a woman who feared much, not wolves, not men, not even dying. But silence. That had teeth. Then came the sound. Not wind, not wood groaning, something else, a muffled thump from the direction of the barn. Martha's hand reached instinctively for the shotgun by the door. A body who lived alone didn't survive out here by being charitable to shadows. She grabbed the lantern and stepped into the storm boots, crunching through thigh-high snowdrifts, her breath clouding in front of her like ghost smoke. The barn stood maybe 30 paces from the house, its roof sagging, but holding. The door was ajar, rocking slightly as if trying to breathe. Martha nudged it wider with the barrel of her shotgun light from the lantern swinging across empty stalls. And then she saw them. A man slumped against the far wall, one hand pressed to his side where blood soaked his coat. His other arm shielded a small girl barely 10, maybe less, curled close to his chest, a shivering pup tucked in her arms like a secret. The girl looked up first. Her face was wind-burnt hair tangled beneath a too-thin scarf, but her eyes were steady, watchful, not pleading, not afraid. Just tired. "Ma'am," the man's voice cracked gravel mixed with blood. "We ain't looking for trouble. Just needed a roof to outlast the storm. We'll be gone come daylight." Martha didn't lower the shotgun immediately, not because she didn't believe him, but because trust is a thing better earned than offered. Still, there was something in the way his arm cradled that girl, in the way the child didn't flinch, even as her lips turned blue. "You're not going anywhere with that wound," Martha muttered, stepping further in. "You bleed out in my barn, I'll be the one left to deal with the stink." The man almost smiled. "Fair enough." "What's her name?" she asked, eyes on the girl. "June," he said, "and the muddy ain't got one yet." Martha huffed through her nose, then turned and left without another word. Back in the house, she ladled stew into a tin bowl, tore off half a loaf of cornbread, and wrapped them in a towel. She lit a second lantern and left the shotgun leaning against the door. When she returned to the barn, the girl June was still upright, still standing like a guard beside her father. Martha set the food down on an overturned crate, placed the lantern beside it, and walked away again. From her window, she watched them. The glow of the lantern cast tall, crooked shadows on the barn walls. The man who hadn't yet given his name sat slouched pain across his brow, but peace in his eyes. June nestled against him, feeding crumbs to the pup. Martha didn't know what exactly she'd let in that night. A stranger, a secret, a memory of something she'd buried too deep. But for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel hollow. It felt like a place someone might return to, a place someone might stay. The morning after the storm, the wind had lost its bite, but the cold clung to the hollow like a warning. Frost coated the fence rails, the water pump, and the broken wheelbarrow that hadn't moved since James passed. Martha Holloway stood on her porch, arms folded across her chest, eyes fixed on the old barn. She hadn't heard a sound all night. Part of her hoped they'd slipped off quietly before dawn, sparing her the burden of strangers. Another part, one she hadn't listened to in years, hoped they hadn't. When she stepped into the barn, she found June sitting cross-legged near the door, picking bits of straw from her scarf. The pup dozed beside her, wrapped in the remains of an old feed sack. Elias lay slumped against the wall, pale but breathing steadier, a makeshift bandage tied around his side. The stew bowl was empty, the cornbread long gone. No thank you note, no signs of intrusion, just a strange kind of stillness, as if their presence had folded into the place like they'd always been there. "Morning." Miss June said, her voice hoarse but polite. "We didn't touch nothing else." Martha offered no reply, just nodded once and turned back toward the house. That afternoon she returned with another bowl, hot grits this time, and set it on the same crate. Again no words. Again the crate was empty by dusk. But the third morning, something changed. June appeared before breakfast, lugging a dented pail of grain and asking if the hens had names. Martha blinked at the child, startled less by the question than by the quiet assumption that she'd be allowed. She didn't answer at first, just stepped aside to let the girl pass through the gate. "That scrappy red one," June pointed. "She looks like a Mabel, feisty." Martha grunted, half amusement, half surrender. From then on, the girl was everywhere. She moved through the farm like a whisper, always careful, never idle. She helped scrub mud from boots left on the porch, untangled twine from the tool hooks in the shed, and spent hours crouched beside the henhouse, murmuring stories only the birds could hear. She never wandered far, never made a mess, and never asked for more than what was given. Elias, meanwhile, kept to the shadows. His recovery was slow, but his presence was evident in quiet details. The stubborn latch on the feed-room door now clicked closed. The rain gutter that once sagged now sat straight. The split in the fence post was bound with tar and twine. She never caught him in the act, but the work was his. She knew it the way a woman knows the difference between empty gesture and real effort. Each evening, Martha found signs of him, small repairs that didn't ask for recognition. And with each one, her guard softened barely. Trust, like healing, had its own pace. Still, the world outside her gate was not as generous. 3 days after the storm, she hitched her mule and rode into Ironwood for supplies. The town hadn't changed. The same sun-bleached storefronts, the same muddy streets, the same quick glances and slower whispers when she passed. At the Mercantile, Sadie Lou tilted her head as Martha walked in, her saccharine voice cutting the air like a blade. "Heard the hollow's not so hollow anymore," Sadie purred. "Saw boot tracks outside your barn. You taking in strays now. Martha, another woman." Judith from the post office chuckled from the shelves. "Maybe she's got herself a drifter." Would explain the long nights. Martha didn't flinch, didn't turn, just grabbed a sack of flour and moved on. But her fingers tightened around the paper like they were trying to squeeze out the sting. At the counter, Mr. Thistle, the shop owner, offered her a nervous nod, eyes flicking toward the door like he expected a fight to follow her out. She said nothing, loaded the supplies onto her wagon, and drove home with her jaw clenched and heart buzzing. That evening she found June waiting on the porch steps, the pup in her lap, a feather tucked behind one ear like a crown. The girl held up a handful of fresh eggs. "The hens don't seem to mind me," she said with a grin. Martha almost smiled. Almost. Later that night, over the soft glow of the lantern, she sat by the window watching as Elias limped across the yard toward the barn. His movements were slow, but purposeful, like a man rebuilding muscle and memory all at once. He paused midway to steady himself against a fence post, one he had likely repaired earlier that day. In that moment, he looked neither wounded nor guilty, but simply tired. A kind of tired she knew well. The kind that comes not from running, but from staying. She remembered James used to come in the same way. Quiet, late, carrying the dust of the day on his boots and the weight of the world on his shoulders. She hadn't seen that walk in years. And now here it was again, wearing a different name. The next morning, June brought a mason jar of fresh milk to the kitchen, holding it like a treasure. "We found the goat behind the shed," she explained. "She ain't dried up. Not yet." Martha took the jar without speaking, but something in her eyes must have flickered because June brightened like sunrise. That afternoon, a new kind of stillness settled over the hollow. Not the silence of grief, but of grace, like the moment between thunder and rain, when the air holds its breath. Martha sat on the porch with her coffee, watching June chase the pup through the yard. Elias sat near the barn, sanding down a splintered crate, his face calm. For the first time in years, the house didn't echo with emptiness. It hummed with breath and laughter and small things that shouldn't have mattered but somehow did. And Martha Holloway, who had long ago resigned herself to the bitter comfort of solitude, realized something unspoken had begun to root in the soil beneath her boots, something that looked a little like hope. It started with a cough. Not loud, not urgent, just a rough edge on the morning stillness. Martha Holloway paused halfway down the porch steps, sack of feed under her arm, and turned toward the barn. Elias was standing by the fence post, one hand gripping the rail tighter than necessary, the other tucked against his ribs. His skin was a shade too pale, his jaw locked as if holding something back. When he moved again, his step faltered, and the weight of his body leaned into the fence like it was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. "You're pushing too hard," Martha called out, not sharp, but not soft either. He didn't answer, just gave her a look, one she recognized instantly. That worn, familiar blend of male pride and self-inflicted silence. James used to wear it like a second skin. Martha dropped the feed sack, crossed the yard, and caught Elias just as his knees buckled. He didn't fight her. There wasn't strength enough for that, but there was resistance in the way his eyes avoided hers. She looped his arm over her shoulder and walked him back toward the house, muttering curses about stubborn men and bleeding hearts. Inside, she guided him to the old settee by the fire. He groaned as he sank down, breath hitching when he shifted wrong. His shirt clung to him damp with sweat despite the chill. Martha lit another log in the hearth and retrieved the basin and clean cloth she kept for her own cuts and bruises, though they'd never felt quite this necessary before. When she pulled back the makeshift bandage from his side, her stomach twisted. The wound, shallow at first, had turned angry and red, swollen along the edges, warm to the touch. It wasn't just healing slow, it was starting to rot. "You let this fester," she muttered, dipping the cloth into vinegar. "Were you planning to cough yourself to death on my furniture?" "Didn't want to trouble you," he rasped. "You're under my roof, Elias Mercer. You're already trouble." A corner of his mouth twitched almost a smile, but pain tugged it flat again. She worked in silence for a while, cleaning the wound, dabbing ointment, wrapping gauze with tight, practiced hands. He winced a few times, but said nothing. The fire crackled between them like a quiet witness. "You're not just a drifter," she said, finally, eyes still on the bandage. "You don't move like one. Don't speak like one either." Elias leaned back against the settee, his breath slow and shaky. "No, I'm not." The room went still. "I was sent to Ironwood under an assumed name," he continued. "Governor appointed me directly. Said the town was rotting from the inside out, land theft, forged deeds, taxation scams, men like Crowley using public funds to buy saloon loyalty and silence." Martha's hand paused. Her fingers curled slowly around the fabric in her lap. "Crowley's boys came to my land 2 winters ago," she said, voice low. "Said James owed back taxes. Told him he'd be evicted if he didn't settle it in 2 days." Elias opened his eyes barely. Didn't know that. He tried to fight them. I told him not to. He still did. What happened? She stood wiping her hands on a cloth that already bore too many stains. He didn't make it past the barn gate. Elias didn't speak for a long time. When he did, it was soft. I'm sorry. Martha shook her head. You didn't pull the trigger, but I was supposed to stop it from ever happening. His voice cracked at the edges, worn down not just by pain, but by guilt. I came to town under orders to stay quiet, shake the system loose one letter at a time. No show of force, no badge, just truth and paperwork. How'd you end up in my barn? They found out sooner than I expected, he said with a dry laugh. Crowley must have had ears in the capital, or maybe someone local caught on. I was shot before I could even file the first report. Crawled into the woods. June found me, kept me moving. We walked for miles with no sense of where to go, just away, till the storm forced us to stop. Martha turned to look at the fireplace. The flames painted shadows across the room, across the floorboards. James had laid the rifle he left behind the worn boots by the door. She still hadn't brought herself to throw out. She called you Papa, she said. She's not mine by blood, Elias answered. Her father, Milo Clay, was my best friend. A man with too much heart and too little luck. He died in a mining collapse in Missouri. When the telegram came, I was the only name she had left. I took her in. Never looked back. Martha nodded slowly. She's strong. She deserves better than what I've given her. She's here, ain't she? Elias blinked hard. His throat worked against emotion he wasn't ready to release. Just then, soft footsteps padded across the floor. June stood in the doorway, clutching the pup and a small jar in her hands. Is he okay? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. He'll live, Martha said, straightening her spine. If he stays put and stops trying to fix the whole world before breakfast. June stepped forward, offering the jar. Inside was a mixture of honey herbs and pine sap, one of the concoctions Martha kept on a shelf above the stove. The girl must have taken it when no one was looking. For his side, June explained. And I found this too. She unwrapped a knitted scarf, moth-eaten but lovingly folded. Martha recognized it. James's old scarf. She thought it lost with the spring cleaning 2 years back. He gets cold, June said simply, and laid it gently across Elias's lap. The room fell quiet again. Not out of awkwardness, but reverence. Elias reached out and placed a hand atop June's. Thank you, Bug. Martha's throat tightened. There was something in the way that girl looked at him, complete trust. And something in the way Elias looked back like a man who'd spent too long carrying loss and had finally found a reason to set it down. The fire popped. The wind outside rattled the shutters, but the house held. Martha turned toward the kitchen without a word. She didn't need to say it. He wasn't a stranger anymore. The air in Widow's Hollow began to change. Not the weather, though the mornings grew clearer, the wind sharper, but something in the way the land carried itself. The crows were quieter. The dogs barked longer at night. And Martha Holloway had taken to sleeping in her rocking chair again, not for comfort, but because she preferred to keep the rifle close. They didn't speak of the message carved into the snow that morning, 2 chickens gutted and strung up on the east fence, blood frozen in angry arcs across the gate. Elias had seen it first, said nothing and begun cleaning before Martha had even opened her door. June didn't ask questions, but her eyes lingered on every shadow the rest of the day. Her shoulders pulled tighter beneath her coat. This ain't random, Martha muttered later, standing in the yard with a coffee cup gone cold in her hand. That was a warning. Elias stood beside her, jaw tight. The bruising around his ribs had faded, but the wound in his side was still a dull ache. He'd grown steadier, stronger, but quieter too. There was a weariness in him that went beyond pain, one that came from knowing the fight hadn't ended with healing, it had just begun. "They're probing," he said, "seeing if I'm still here, if I'm still breathing." "You are," Martha replied, "and they don't like it." He looked over at her brow, furrowed. "You don't owe me this, Martha." "No," she said, "I don't." She tossed the rest of the coffee into the dirt and walked away. That night she returned with a sharpened hatchet, setting it by the barn door without a word. She also moved her rocker closer to the front window, the rifle propped against the wall beside her. When Elias came in after sunset, he found a second cup of coffee waiting on the table. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. The following morning, June stood at the base of the porch steps with a bundled blanket in her arms. "Miss Martha," she said, "if it's safer somewhere else, we can go. Papa says we're good at leaving." Martha knelt, her hands gently brushing the snow from the girl's cheek. "Maybe you've been leaving too long, sugar," she said. "Might be time to stay." June didn't respond right away, but that evening she helped tie up the coop door with fresh rope and fed the chickens without being asked. Out in town, things were stirring. Whispers coiled through the saloon like smoke. Some said the Hollow was harboring a threat. Others said Elias Mercer had never left and was gathering evidence. The town council, led still informally by Crowley, was restless. Tensions flared in quiet corners, but never in the open. That was how Ironwood handled its rot, not with fire, but with mold and silence. It was Sheriff Harlan who showed up next. His horse kicked up dust as it approached the Hollow, slow and steady, like the man himself. Martha saw him from the porch, narrowed her eyes, and didn't move. "Morning, Marty," the sheriff said, removing his hat. He didn't step past the gate. "What brings you here, Harlan? Thought your spine was still stuck to Crowley's back pocket." He gave a tight smile. "I ain't here to lecture, just here to say word's getting loud. You keeping Mercer hidden is making some folks nervous." Martha crossed her arms. "A man bleeding to death in a barn isn't exactly staging a rebellion." Harlan's voice dropped. "You know how this town works. Fear don't need truth to justify its noise. He's not the threat, but maybe it's time the real ones got scared." A long pause settled between them. The sheriff didn't argue, just nodded once and tipped his hat. "Take care, Martha. You always had more fight in you than the whole council combined." She didn't respond until he was halfway down the trail. "This time I'm not fighting for ghosts." That night they sat around the fire, the three of them. No one talked much. June braided a bit of rope for the pup's neck. Elias cleaned the chamber of his revolver, slow and quiet. Martha sharpened a blade she hadn't touched since the year James died. Her hands were steady. Elias broke the silence. "If this gets worse, it will," Martha cut in. "Then you need to be ready to walk away from this place." She met his gaze, firm. "I buried one man on this land. I'll be damned if I let them chase another off it." He looked at her a long time. His face, usually unreadable, gave way to something else, something like relief. "I'm staying too," he said. Later, after June had gone to sleep curled by the fire, Elias sat on the edge of the porch while Martha poured herself another cup. The wind carried the faint scent of pine, sharp and grounding. "I didn't come here expecting to survive," he said. "You didn't come here expecting someone to care either," she replied. "No," he said. "But you did." She didn't answer, just sat beside him, letting the silence say what words could not. Their shoulders brushed, neither pulled away. Somewhere in the dark, a wolf howled. The dogs didn't bark. In the days that followed, they began to prepare. Elias gathered his papers, the ones he'd salvaged from the courier satchel when he first arrived. Martha rode into town not for supplies, but to make herself seen. She stood taller, met eyes, dared them to speak. She wore James's coat and Elias's steadiness. and the town noticed. By the end of the week, Martha had written to the regional court herself, invoking a clause James once taught her about emergency land seizure and corrupt taxation. Elias added his signature. Sheriff Harlan surprisingly added his too. When the town council announced a public meeting to discuss rumors of leadership interference, Martha Holloway was the first to show up. Not as a widow, not as a quiet woman tending chickens, but as someone who had chosen not to run. And the man beside her, Elias Mercer, wasn't hiding anymore either. The town hall of Ironwood was more barn than bastion. Rough-hewn beams lined the walls, dust clung to the windows, and the air held the weight of too many whispered deals. It was never meant for speeches, it was meant for containment. And yet on the day of the public hearing, folks crammed in tight, their boots dragging on the warped floorboards, their eyes darting toward the front table where the town council sat like aging vultures with ink-stained fingers. Martha Holloway stood just inside the door, spine straight, chin set. She wore a plain dress, an old duster slung over her shoulders, and James's boots polished for the first time in years. Her hair was tied back neat, but not apologetic. Beside her, Elias Mercer adjusted the collar of his coat, the sealed folder of court petitions and land appeals tucked under one arm. His face bore no badge, but something about his presence had shifted. He no longer looked like a man hiding, he looked like one waiting to be seen. The room quieted when they stepped forward. Crowley, still lounging like the throne hadn't been yanked from beneath him, offered a crooked smile and a slow clap. Well now, didn't expect the hollow widow to come storming in with her strays. Martha didn't flinch. Didn't expect you'd still be in that seat. A few murmurs rippled through the benches. This meeting announced Councilman Hartwick, clearing his throat, was called to address recent disruptions, claims of unlawful land occupation, questions of leadership, legitimacy, and concerns over outside interference. Martha stepped closer to the center, her voice clear but measured. Ironwood's rot didn't start when Elias came to town. It started when this room decided silence was easier than integrity. There was a pause. No rebuttal, just the creak of wood beneath shifting weight. I buried my husband 2 winters back. She continued, gaze flicking to the side window where the mountains loomed like witnesses. Crowley's men came with fake ledgers and tin-star warnings. Shot him on our own land. I stayed quiet because I thought no one would stand with me. She turned to Elias now. But someone did. Elias moved forward, unfolding a document from his folder. I was sent here by executive order, not as a sheriff, not as a soldier, but as a reformer. I came with letters, not bullets. But letters weren't enough. He laid the paper on the table. This is a petition signed by landowners, merchants, ranch hands, and yes, Sheriff Harlan himself, demanding an audit of Ironwood's council, demanding new eyes on old deals, demanding truth. Crowley leaned back, arms crossed. Truth don't mean much if no one listens. Then a voice rose from the back, soft but firm. He fixed my roof, came a man's call. Didn't ask for payment. Just said it needed doing. Another woman spoke. He sat with my boy when he got sick. Walked 5 miles to fetch medicine from the foothills. More followed. Like an old dam cracking under pressure, the room filled with small testaments not of authority, but of action. Then came the smallest voice of all. June stepped forward, the pup cradled in her arms like a living shield. She looked up at the council, unblinking. My papa fixes things, she said, her voice shaking but sure. Not just doors and fences. He fixes people too. Even Miss Martha. That last line broke the room's breath. No one moved. Then slowly applause began. Not the thunderous kind, but the kind that comes from something true, being said out loud. Crowley's chair scraped the floor as he stood. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just turned and walked out the side door, his boots heavy with irrelevance. Sheriff Harlan stepped forward, tipping his hat toward Martha and Elias. "The council recognizes the change in leadership," he said. "Effective immediately." But Elias didn't ask for keys. He didn't move into the mayor's brick house with the balcony and green shutters. Instead, he stayed at Harper's Hollow, though the townsfolk had started calling it Mercer Hill. Martha corrected them every time. It was Holloway land before it was anyone's. It still is, she'd say. Life didn't shift with explosions. It shifted in habits. In porch repairs and early morning hoofprints near the well where town kids came to fill their buckets. It shifted when Sadie Lou, once the loudest gossip in Ironwood, showed up with a basket of apple turnovers and a stiff apology. "Not every woman strong enough to speak gets heard," she said quietly, setting the basket on Martha's porch. "But you were." And then she left no further words. Elias, for his part, made no speeches. He wrote letters, helped sort property records, and spent long hours fixing things with his hands. Fences, roofs, trust. Martha watched it unfold in real time. One afternoon, she stepped out to find June standing in the garden holding a sprouting marigold in her palm. Her cheeks were smudged with dirt, her braid half undone. "Miss Martha," she said, "I think it's growing." Martha knelt beside her fingers, brushing the damp soil. "They say marigolds keep bad spirits away." June smiled. "Then let's plant a whole row." By spring, the garden had bloomed wild with flowers and vegetables. Townsfolk came by not to gawk, but to help, to ask advice, to share coffee and trade seed. And inside the house, laughter returned. Not loud, not constant, but real. Elias rebuilt the barn's loft into a room for June just beneath the rafters. Martha found herself humming again when she cooked. And June wrote her name into the soil every time she planted something new, as if saying, "I was here. I chose to stay." One evening, as the sun dropped low behind the hills, Elias leaned against the porch post, a coffee mug in hand. "You think it'll last?" he asked. Martha didn't look up. Things that grow quiet usually do. He turned toward her. "You ever wonder why this place held on?" She met his gaze. "Because we did." As fireflies blinked across the pasture and the barn glowed warm behind them, it was clear Ironwood hadn't changed because someone took charge. It changed because someone stayed. By the time summer leaned into Ironwood, the town no longer whispered about Martha Holloway's porch. They walked toward it. The barn still creaked when the wind got up, and the front gate still sagged a little, but the land felt different now. Not because it had changed hands, but because it had finally found the right ones willing to stay. Elias Mercer never hung a sign that said Mayor, and Martha never called herself a leader. But every fence mended, every hand reached across the garden beds, and every child that ran barefoot through the field told a quieter truth: the Hollow had become a home again, not just for the three of them, but for anyone learning how to begin again. What they built wasn't grand. It didn't involve lawmen or proclamations. It was forged in firewood stacked on porches, in seed packets, swapped between neighbors, in coffee shared in silence after long days. Elias still carried his scar. His limp remained. And there were mornings he moved like a man twice his age, but his hands were steady now, sure of their work. June, clever, stubborn. June had become the spirit of the place, known for feeding every hen by name and weaving marigolds into the collars of passing dogs. She kept a notebook beneath her bed full of stories and hand-sketched maps of the Hollow, marking where the wild strawberries grew and where Elias once fell asleep, repairing the well pump. Martha, once the silent widow, whom the town tiptoed around, no longer hid behind lace curtains or answered slights with silence. She spoke up at town meetings not to scold, but to steady the room with simple truths. Folks listened because they remembered what she'd endured, and more importantly, what she'd stayed for. Her voice had never been loud, but now it rang with the weight of a woman who had chosen not to break when the world gave her every excuse to. Ironwood itself didn't become a utopia. The saloon still stank of spilt whiskey, and the hills beyond still hid the occasional rustler. But change, as it turned out, didn't need to arrive with fireworks. It could ride in on the back of a slow mule cart and a man with calloused hands and too much silence in his eyes. It could take root in the hollow of a woman who had lost everything and still chose to give something back. What made it real wasn't what Elias fixed, it was who he fixed it with. And that was the difference. Because in the end it wasn't the title of mayor or the council's ruling that transformed the town. It was the child who planted marigolds in a busted crate, the widow who laid out supper without asking why, the man who patched a stranger's roof and never asked for payment. It was the quiet decision made 100 different ways to stay, to build, to try again. One evening, as fireflies danced over the pasture and the stars crept out over the hills, the three of them sat on the porch. Elias, his boots kicked out before him, sipped slowly from his tin mug. Martha sat beside him, a basket of mending on her lap, while June dozed with her head against her shoulder. Her pup curled across her legs. The wind was soft that night. No warnings, no weight, just peace. Elias glanced sideways. "You think we've done enough?" Martha didn't answer right away. She reached over, covered his hand with hers, and said quietly, "We stayed. That's always enough." And somewhere deep in the soil of that stubborn little hollow, something bloomed. If this story stirred something in your soul, a memory, a tear, a spark of hope, don't forget to subscribe to Whispers of the West. Here we honor tales of quiet courage, healing, and redemption from the heart of the frontier. New stories every week that stay with you long after the fire dies down.